Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. Are you worried that sometimes your miniatures lack visual interest for the viewer? Most painters struggle with this at some point in time. But don't worry. In this episode, I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to fix this. Let's get to it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. Have you ever picked up a model and thought it looked just off, with the details all blurred together? You know, the tiny points of interest just don't stand out on the subject, causing the model to look flat and two-dimensional, which of course leads to a lack of visual interest for the viewer. Has this happened to you? Of course it has, or at least it will, as grappling with this issue is part of developing your skill as an artist. Over the years, I've seen the most technically proficient painters with a deep understanding of how to use the brush fall victim to this problem, especially when other 2D artists transition to the 3D subject of model painting. But what actually causes this problem? Defining the issue is difficult because the problem comes from an issue with theory, not skill. Essentially, though, what's missing is readability. This is a term borrowed from graphic arts, and it essentially means that the model is being viewed as a whole, and the individual parts that hold key information for the meaning of the piece aren't standing out. The individual yet important details aren't obvious enough for the viewer to process their meaning and value. This is a key piece of theory in miniature painting that needs to be grasped to unlock 3D painting skills. Now, I could just jump to the solution, but bear with me, as an understanding of the properties at play in your art will of course pay off in the long run. The first thing to understand is that a model is just that, a model, a representation of something larger that exists in the real world, or at least has some analog to it in the case of sci-fi subjects. Because of this, most novice painters will reason like this: the tank I'm painting is green, so I'll paint the miniature tank green. And, of course, after you do this, the results look just kind of bad. This is because light collects differently on larger real-world subjects than on their 28mm or 1/100 scale, or whatever scale equivalent you're working with. Most miniature painters and artists in general figure this out quickly and add shades and highlights to imply that the subject interacts with light like its approximation in the real world. Additionally, after trial and error, most painters grasp that the smaller the scale, the more extreme the exaggeration the interplay of light with the subject should be. This fundamentally helps the model look appropriate to the viewer, but even the most proficient highlighters and shaders will usually still struggle with readability, because you need to push your exaggeration that much more on the key details. There are 3 elements to this. First, you need to decide on the key details. Second, you need to paint these details to a higher standard than the background elements. And lastly, you need to build strong contrast to center them out. Let's look at each of these in turn. Deciding on the key details is pretty subjective. This involves you deciding which elements of the model define its meaning and reveal its character and intent. This should be done for your subject before you ever pick up a brush, or at least after you prime, but before you go any further. This might sound daunting, but it's really not. You have to just ask yourself what makes a model distinctive and interesting. Since as miniature painters, we're usually painting some sort of soldier, uniform components are the easy choice. Patches, equipment, signs of rank, etc. are all good. Weapons may also be a good option too, although since they're usually at the periphery of the miniature and could drag your attention away from the other details, you must decide this on a case-by-case basis. Another must here is to go to work on the model's faces and eyes. That is, if the subject has a face or eyes. This is because humans are drawn to look at these things, so these details should be centered out specifically. Beyond these considerations, what should be apparent for special detail can be subject to interpretation. And that's okay. It's your art after all. You don't have to zero in on the same details as the next painter if they're working on the same piece. You just have to decide and stick to the process. Second comes the standard to which you pick out the details. Once you've determined what you want to focus on, then paint it so that it's not left in the background. Often this involves adding an extra layer or two of highlighting over the majority of the areas of the model. Extra shading can also be good too. Waterslide transfers and freehand work are great options as well to accentuate these features on the model. But the real secret weapon here is using color theory. If you want something to stand out, consider giving it maximum contrast from the background by making it a complementary color. If you check a color wheel, the complementary color is opposite the color that's in the majority. So as an example, the bluish coat on this French Napoleonic general is opposite orangey yellows, so the braid indicating its importance is yellowish. And since this is Marshal Ney, who was legendary for his orangish red hair, I paint that orange-yellow too. This stands out from the uniform and lets you know who you're dealing with. What about a subject that's kind of monotone, without any obvious markings, and where consistency demands one dominant color? Well, you should still search for complementary options. Here's another tank, which is obviously green, so for a complement you need red. Traditionally, model builders solve this by introducing red tones through rust and paint chips. You don't want to weather the model? No problem. Use reddish sensors, vision blocks, or searchlight lenses to solve the issue. While talking about red though, I need to warn you, the human brain has a special affinity for this color. It conveys fiery emotion and danger and attracts the eye. So when using red tones, you want to go where the viewer's attention should be. If you use red and put it at the periphery of the model, you could upset the interest of the subject. The classic example is the beginner painting a warrior armed with a sword. The sword is usually held high, away from the body of the model, and quite distant from the points of largest visual interest, usually the face. But everyone wants to paint blood on the tip of the sword, right? Well, don't. The viewer will be drawn to the red of the blood, far away from the more interesting elements on the model, messing up your visual interest. As I alluded to before, if the model has a face and/or eyes, and it's at a scale where it's practical to do so, pull out all the stops on this. People are drawn to the face and eyes of the human form. It's hardwired into us for evolutionary reasons. Faces and eyes are the primary method for conveying emotion for your subject, so work with this in mind. Does that eye need a pupil to establish direction for the action of the model? Yes? Well, get out a small brush and paint it. Does the evil glowing eyes of the undead need an extra white dot to imply a glint of malice? Then just do so. These extra features may be hard to paint, but they'll go a long way to make your subject more engaging, and since you're going to have to paint these things eventually, you might as well get the practice in now. The third and final point I want to touch on here relates back to the oh-so-important element of contrast. If you want a component of the model to stand out, you can and should separate it from the rest of the subject to remain distinct. How can you do this? You can line in. Lining in is the process of tracing around a point of detail on the subject with a really dark color, usually black, and this will help it stand out. But how do you actually line in? Well, I favor two methods for this, the precise way and the fast way. First, we'll talk about the precise way, and be warned, this is time-consuming, but it will pay off. First, grab a black acrylic paint and thin it so it's still opaque, but it flows nicely. Medium is better than water for this, but water works if that's all you have. Or better still, get a bottle of airbrush flow improver, as this thins the paint and breaks the surface tension, helping it flow to the lowest point on the model. Seriously, even if you don't have an airbrush, some flow improver really helps. Next, grab a fine tip brush and go to work tracing around the detail. And that's all there really is to this. But it can be a slow process, which brings me to the next option, the fast way. This requires mineral spirits thinner, enamel panel liner, and a cup, as well as a ratty brush. If you're working with acrylics, it's not super necessary, but you might want to varnish your model with a gloss or satin varnish before using the enamels. This will make sure all of your underlying work isn't damaged. First, pour some thinner into a cup, then moisten the surface of the model with a ratty brush. The thinner will accumulate in the crevices and around your details. Next, stir or shake the panel liner, and while the thinner is still damp, deposit the enamel into the crevices or outline around your details. The low surface tension of the enamel and the assistance of the thinner should cause the liner to go to the lowest points and around the details you want to center out, just where you want it. So there you have it, my method to enhance the readability of your miniatures and models. With these 3 steps, you won't need to worry about producing flat, visually uninteresting models again. So grab your miniatures, think about those details, paint them up to draw the eye, and get lining in. In the end, you'll bring your art to the next level. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon for awesome deals and perks, and support my channel while doing it. See you next time for more miniature gaming, painting, and diorama videos. But most importantly, until then, remember to keep building life in miniature.